Good evening. Welcome back to The Bible Speaks Today from LBC TV. I usually have something to say at the program about something totally unrelated. During the break, just to recap, and I know I've said this so many times, but we record these two programs back to back, same night, which is why I'm always in the same clothes, although you see them a week later, you know, just like any other previously recorded program. During the break tonight, I usually stretch my legs and go out, and the chief cameraman said, "Come and look at this." So I went outside the studio to one of the windows in the church body out here, and today is the 29th of April. It is bucketing down out there. So what usually happens when it buckets down as much as it does is occasionally you'll see the lights flicker, and possibly even the cameras, although they do have a time delay on them, they'll stay on. But in the event you see the odd light flickering and things, it's not God's judgment. It's a big storm. Okay, so hopefully by the time you see this, it's in a distant memory. Although those of you who follow the news, and most of us do, you'll know that earlier on this week there was a devastating storm in Arkansas, tornadoes in Arkansas and Oklahoma, Mississippi, and you know, sometimes when you see these things, it seems unreal to you. You know, you look at the devastation and you don't know the town, you don't know anybody there, thank goodness, and it doesn't really seem real. And yet when I read the paper today, I saw that one had been found near Tupelo, and I know Tupelo, Mississippi quite well. I did a lot of business travel down that area at one time, and you suddenly thought, oh, I know those people down there, that must have been frightening. And then it brings it home to you just how scary some of these things are. Something to think about, right? Okay. We have been talking this last week about Paul's letter to Philemon, the shortest letter, the more personal letter, and certainly the most personal letter, I think, of all the Paul's letters that we know of the Bible. Just to recap, by the way, most people will tell you that Paul wrote 13 letters, and yet most scholars will say that Paul, we can only attribute for sure 7 of them to Paul exactly. Some of them might have been written by other people for Paul or in his name, or to carry on Paul's idea. Philemon is one of those ones that we're almost 100% certain, although we can look at this in a minute and say, you know, well, maybe he didn't. But and whilst people say to me, why do you even mention this? I say, well, if you're going to understand the Bible, if you're going to take it seriously, it's interesting to know that whilst what the Bible says is always informative, right? It's not always, you know, what is it Paul Gimbest says? It ain't necessarily so. There are things in the recorded Bible that we need sometimes to look at more closely and understand where they're coming from. I mean, I think it's pretty admirable when somebody writes a letter as if it was coming from a previously well-known figure, exhorting people for the love of Christ. I can't see anything particularly wrong with that, especially in the days when it was written. That was the accepted practice. Of course, nowadays it's called plagiarism or everything else, you know, and we are going to be upset about it. But you know, it just, to me, it makes it interesting. It makes the Bible a living, breathing document, not some dusty old tome that sits on the shelf and you refer to once a week on Sundays, if then. And I hope you're not doing that, by the way. I hope you've got your Bibles out handy. Well, anyway, we were talking about Onesimus and being a slave, and the basic, you know, the basic letter, the whole theme of the letter, if you will, reconciliation, forgiveness, is Paul taking the time while he's in prison to send Onesimus back to Philemon, who's a leader, leads the church in his house in Colossae, somewhere near Colossae, where the Colossians live, okay, and in Greece, and taking the trouble to say, look, he's a runaway slave, he's become a Christian, he's coming back, face the music or whatever, and what I want you to do is treat him with Christian love as one Christian brother to another. Okay? Now there's some interesting connotations about this letter which we'll deal with later in the program. But first of all, we've got to there's a little bit of a problem here. You know, my problem is I look at something and say, yeah, I understand that, but why were they there in the first place? Why is that? Why is this? So, you've got to understand why is Onesimus with Paul? Did Paul meet him on his travels before he got arrested? Did he come and visit him, you know, in prison, and they got to know each other? If Paul was imprisoned in Ephesus, that would be more likely. I hardly think a runaway slave in Greece would be running to Rome to hide out. I mean, you know, kind of not the thing to do. It's like, you know, somebody trying to dodge the IRS going to live in Washington, D.C., across the road from the IRS building. Probably not a good thing, you know. However, we don't know. So how did Paul get to know him? I mean, there are some suggestions that he was with Paul when Paul got arrested, you know, carrying on as a helper, and when Paul got, you know, wrapped up by the Gestapo or whatever whoever called him, you know, did they just drag him on with him, you know? Okay. The Christian view, a very predominant Catholic view, is from what I can gather looking at my sources, Onesimus met Paul by chance, heard about him, and came to see him. Again, which seems to point towards Ephesus and not so much to more Rome, you know, and most Christians would view that by divine providence. You know, oh, and God must have guided him. And whilst there's no, I don't say God couldn't do that, most things like this have a more practical and more obvious solution. And again, see, now, there's a Professor Callahan, about, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, he challenges Onesimus' status as a slave. Because there is only one verse, in verse 16, which actually talks about him being a slave, because he says not as a slave but as a man. Okay? And I say Professor Callahan makes the point that nothing in the text, you know, conclusively, you know, shows that Onesimus was ever, you know, belonging to Philemon. He was purchased. You know, there's no real thing. I think that's kind of stretching it a bit. I mean, if Paul mentions the fact he not as a slave but as a free man, then you've got to assume that previously was a slave. However, as I said, the word slave has some different connotations. It can be the sort of slave where you capture and you run slaves, or you go to the slave market and buy them, or somebody becomes an indentured servant, and they tend to sort of use the same word with slight variations for the same thing. Yeah. And as I just had whispered to me from the cameraman, that maybe he got saved and that changed his mind about the whole thing. You know, who knows? We don't know. Anyway, you know, what's interesting is, and I find this very interesting, that if you were an escaped slave and you heard about this great Christian teacher who preached that Christ was love and we're all equal, etc., 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 okay? So you think, that's the man I need to meet. And you go and meet him, maybe in prison with him, maybe you just meet him or whatever, visit him. I can't believe Paul was walking the streets of Ephesus or Rome when he was in jail. And you say, look, I'm an escaped slave and I've become a Christian and I want to know more about Jesus. And the master says, fine, go back home. I mean, that's not what you would be expecting, is it? You would be expecting him to say, fine, I'll put you in touch with some people. They can smuggle you through Greece and they can go through Turkey and then you can go there and you can have a fresh start. You know? I mean, a lot of modern commentators kind of gloss over this, but some brave souls, you know, have tacitly admitted that Onesimus didn't get what you'd expected a Christian to do for a runaway slave. I mean, let's suppose you're back in the days of the bad old days of Civil War, pre-Civil War in this country, and you're a religious man running a pastor or something like that, and a guy knocks on your door and says, "Hi, I'm Joseph, and I'm a runaway slave from Alabama, and I've become a Christian, and I'm beseeching you to, help me," and this sort of thing. And the pastor says, "Great, love you, brother, glad you're a Christian, now get your buns back there and go back to your master." Not exactly what you'd be thinking about, is it? Okay? And there's some commentators on this that remark that the anti-Marcion letter we talked about years and years ago, back in the very early days of the church, are very silent about Onesimus' status, about what could possibly happen to him. I mean, you've got to understand that back then a slave who ran away could be put to death for running away. I mean, kind of backhanded, stupid way to do it. I mean, if you've got a slave and he runs away and you paid, 90 shekels for him, it's a bit stupid that if he comes back and you have him executed or in prison, he's no good to you, is it? You'd think you might punish him, of course. I'm sure that would have happened. But anyway, it's always been a bit of a problem, okay, where Onesimus is a slave. If he is a slave, he's sent back to his master. Now, okay, he's sent back with a letter from Paul, the great Paul, who probably wasn't as known as great in those days, was just Paul the preacher, with a letter to his friend Philemon saying, hey, this is your guy, he's come to me, he's saved, he's a brother in Christ. Now, when he comes back, I want you to forgive him. He doesn't say let him free, does he? He doesn't say when he comes back, make him a free man, this sort of thing, although he could have done, I suppose. But he asked him to treat him as an equal in love. Well, we don't know how Philemon was, but that's putting a lot on the man. I mean, obviously, if he was a Christian, he still had a slave. Now, people have had this problem with early church for centuries. If you look at what Paul preached, he said master or slave were all the same. You would imagine that any person who was converted to Christianity in the early church, 1st century BC AD, would have immediately freed all his slaves. But you don't hear that, do you? There's not a big song and dance about it, not in Acts, not in anywhere else. Slaves seem to be, the de rigueur. It's a standard practice, and yeah, while we're Christians, don't be silly, we're not giving up our slaves. I mean, there was that school of thought even in this country not so long ago. It's just an interesting thing in the letter. So what you got is Paul writes this wonderful letter to Philemon, and it's full of reconciliation and forgiveness, but it doesn't really resolve Onesimus' status. He's still a slave. Paul doesn't say release him. He says, treat him like a brother. There's another interpretation of this, of course, that Onesimus wasn't a slave, maybe a fellow worker, maybe an indentured servant whose time had run out, or whatever. And when Paul uses the word in verse 16 for it's a slave but free, he's not meaning bought slave, but indentured servant. And maybe that Onesimus and Philemon had gotten into a big argument or something. Maybe Onesimus had said, "That's it, I quit. I'm out of here," and was traveling around the countryside when he ran into Paul, and they're both Christians. And somebody went, I forget which author it was, said maybe they were even related by blood. Maybe he was a brother or a cousin or a nephew or something like that. But certainly by religion, they both were followers of Christ. And that's not such a bad situation. It could have happened. But the intent of the letter was to reconcile the two men. Now bear in mind, as I said so many times, when Paul wrote his letters, and I take the out, with the possible exception of Romans, when Paul wrote his letters, he was writing to deal with a situation in the here and now. He didn't write Philemon as an example of reconciliation and forgiveness for the rest of us. The fact that it is, I think, is God's will, and it's amazing that we can read the letter and say, hey, you know, if a guy can take back somebody at this stage, we can forgive and take back other people. Okay? But apart from this letter, there's really no reference to Onesimus. He just appears out of nowhere. All right? And in fact, the only reference we can find to him is in Colossians 4, where Paul talks about Onesimus as a faithful and beloved brother. Now, Colossians was written before Philemon. Okay, quite a long way before. So, if Onesimus was a faithful and beloved brother, was he a member of the household of Philemon? Could he have been a slave? It's kind of interesting to see this, how this all fits together. Either way, it's a perfect example of Paul to demonstrate Christian love and affection by saying, hey, whatever he is, escaped slave, recalcitrant brother, you know, an employee who got mad, you know, nephew, uncle, whatever, take him back, and let's take him back with love, and let's not you know, hold it against him, that sort of thing. Okay. So as I say, he calls him a faithful and beloved brother, and everybody states. Paul even mentions Titus and says he's a beloved brother as well, and a faithful minister and a fellow servant. So, you know, this Onesimus isn't just one-sided character who turns up with Paul in prison. He's somebody who Paul had previous dealings with. So it makes an interesting contrast, okay? It says, that's Titus I sent to you, okay? With Onesimus, a faithful and beloved brother who is one of you, they shall make known unto you all the things which are done here. So obviously Onesimus was on the inside, you know, which understood Paul and was able to take Paul's message and follow it up. Now, our friend Martin Luther had a very good expression for Paul's tactful, if you like, letter to Philemon. He calls it holy flattery, which is kind of interesting, you know. I mean, he saw what he saw in this letter was a distinct parallel between Paul and Christ in the work of reconciliation, which tied into the concept of Christian grace. But even so what Martin Luther's saying, hey, this letter is exactly what, you know, here's a guy who's done a bad thing, and we're sending him back and saying, hey, forgive him and take him back into the fold. And that's exactly what Christ does. With the spirit of grace and forgiveness, he takes something that is bad, turns it into good, and sends it back. But even Martin kind of insisted that the letter upheld the social status quo. In other words, it didn't say, and he's a slave no more because we don't believe in that, or you mustn't treat him as a slave. He simply sends him back to whatever status he was in. And Martin Luther, of course, thought he would have been a slave. It's only modern scholars that have started looking this a bit closer and saying, well, maybe he wasn't. But anyway, the early church certainly, right the way through the centuries, accepted the fact that Onesimus was a slave. So Martin Luther's letter basically says that it held the social status quo. All right? I mean, you could interpret the letter to indicate that Paul did absolutely nothing to change Onesimus' legal position as a servant, if not a slave, an indentured servant, and that Paul was simply complying with Roman law in returning him to Philemon, which is exactly what the law said. If you found a slave, you had to return him to his owner. In fact, the laws in this country prior to the Civil War, and I presume, well, prior to the Civil War, I guess, that was the rule. If you found a runaway slave, you were legally bound to turn him over. The people who ran the Underground Railway and that were actually taking a great risk of imprisonment themselves by the authorities, because the law was, whether you liked it or not, the law was, hey, you're a runaway slave, I've got to tell the constable he's got to send you back. But you could also take the line that the text could be you could interpret it this way, that Paul was basically demanding the legal freedom of Onesimus. As I said, he doesn't say that, but if you look at the text a bit closely, if it's an act of trust and reconciliation and holding, if you like, Philemon accountable in God's eyes, if you will, to accomplish the change. In other words, sending him back to you, no longer a slave, but free. He's kind of putting the ball in Philemon's court and saying, hey, you know, you're supposed to be one of us. You're a leader in the church. I'm sending back a slave who you should free. He's a good and loyal servant. It's this letter. This letter has been used, unfortunately. This letter has been used over the centuries and quoted as a Christian foundation document for the justification of slavery. In other words, look, even Paul thought it was right, he sent him back. And in fact, there was a huge debate in Britain, and England's no different. England, I think, conjured up the idea of slaves. But I mean, England and later America, and the struggles for the abolition of slavery, that was one of the big bones of contention. That people cited Philemon, whichever side you were on, as support. If you were on the pro-slavery side, you said, hey, it's in the Bible. Paul sent him back. He said, okay, you're a Christian, we love you and all that, but back you go. And the anti-side said, well, no, Paul's sending him back, but he's saying, hey, you know, you need to be Christian about this and release him. But it's an interesting fact that the Bible stories, the letters of other people as well as Paul, and even the history that we have at the time from people like Josephus and things like that, don't have this big thing about all these people who became Christian and released their slaves. Many, many Jews living in Jerusalem under Judaism at the time of Paul's preaching owned slaves. I mean, it wasn't it was the way it was. You could buy slaves, you could buy indentured servants. The Jews tended to go more for indentured servants, but you know, they had no freedom of their own, so what's the difference? But anyway, there wasn't this great, and you don't read about when people came to Christ, like at Pentecost, 5,000 people come to Jesus, right, and accept the Holy Spirit. Most of them obviously Jews who lived in Jerusalem, but some obviously a great crowd of people from elsewhere. You don't see in the next paragraph that says, and straightway they went home and freed their slaves. You never hear it mentioned. It never comes up. Now maybe they did, I don't know. Maybe they did. But it was a social phenomena in those days that people had slaves, and you would think that if somebody accepted Christ, as Philemon had done, and was a leader in a church, the last thing that they would want to have is slaves. Okay? But, as Paul says, you know, or as far as commentators have said, we don't know. We really don't know. Philemon is one of those letters that on the face of it is a simple little letter saying, hey, I'm sending you back, sending your man back to you with a letter asking you to forgive him. That's what it says. Right? But in fact, there's a lot more to it. When you start to realize who the players are. Here, leader in the church over here in Colossae. You know, call him a bishop if you will, but you know, don't think so. They don't think they had bishops in those days. But anyway, a leader, maybe they translated the word, the overseer. I mean, the word bishop doesn't mean what we mean it today. It was simply an overseer. Okay, so the leader of the house church here, you know, full of Christian joy and vigor and expanding church. And over here we have his slave servant, whatever it is, okay, who Paul is with. Now, I can't believe that Onesimus was in prison with Paul. How did he get out? If he was an escaped slave, he would have remained in jail until somebody came and got him, or they sent him back. I don't know how they did it in those days. Maybe they had the Roman US Marshal type thing, and they came and got him and took him back. Either way, it would have been almost impossible for him to get out of jail. So I've got to assume that he was somebody that had met Paul either on the journey or in his journeys, knew about him, and then went to see him, which was, you allowed visitors even in those days. In fact, if you didn't have visitors, you didn't eat, because they brought food and that for you. So he gets, and so Paul knows about his situation. Says, look, I'm going to do something for you. I'm going to write this letter to your boss, to your owner, or whatever he was, and I'm going to say, here, I need you to go back. You're working in the church there. I know you are, because I've commented on your solid work before. You need to go back, and you need to say, boss, I'm sorry, whatever I did, either ran away or quit when I shouldn't have done, whatever. I'm ready to face the consequences, but we're both Christians, we should be able to work this out. And Paul really puts the onus on Philemon. There's a lot of gentle pressure there. I'm sending him back. We're not going to make a fuss about this. He's coming back of his own accord. He's bearing this letter from me to you, personal, my personal request to you. Just whatever you have to do, treat him like a Christian brother and make him free. And he basically says that. And that's a big thing for Philemon to have to do. I mean, not difficult to do in the sense you just could have said, okay, you're free. But, maybe there's a loss of finance or, I don't know. But if Onesimus was working with Philemon in the church in Colossae, then it seems fairly logical that he would have stayed there. But once again, once this letter is written, we never hear about him again. He doesn't appear in any of the later, no, there's not too many later letters. This is one of the latest. Interesting. Read Philemon again. See what you get out of it. And as always, you can send me an email discussing, all right? Until next week then, good night and God bless you.